Hi, I'm Abigail Sutherland. This course here, Teaching Geeks to Fish, I use that because the old saying of, give someone a fish and they can eat for a day, teach someone to fish and they can eat for a lifetime. So let me explain who I am and why I'm doing this. So yeah, my name's Abigail Sutherland. I'm the information architect for the navigation area of TomTom. So I don't do all of our navigation, but I do it for my area. Information architect in this case is a title without a job description. I basically am the person who ranted so much about the bad quality of our documentation that finally they said, shut up and do something about it. So that's what I'm doing. Personally, I'm from all over the place. I'm American, spent time in Britain, lived in the Netherlands for 11 years now. I've done everything from accountancy, testing on platforms from mainframe to mobile, and now basically the fact that I spend all my time writing and hang out with writers online has turned into a job. So I've given you my contact stuff on the Write the Docs. I'm Abby, and that's my icon. I'm Evil Rooster on Twitter. That is my personal Twitter, so you will find a lot of opinions and stuff there. Actually, if you find Evil Rooster on the web, it's very frequently me. So how did I end up in this situation? I could give you the long, epic story of why we ended up here and a budget and yada, yada, blah, blah, blah. But let's just cut that out. 4 reasons. Our developers write some of our documentation, specifically documentation for developers, so API documentation, SDK documentation. And I decided that we didn't have the budget to fix that, so instead I was going to teach them how. And everybody said, nonsense, what a stupid idea. Developers hate writing, and they're terrible at it, and they don't know how to do it. I said, hang on, let's go through that again. Developers hate writing, and they're terrible at it because they don't know how to do it. I can fix that. Writing is a teachable skill. I have friends who run writing workshops. I'll steal all the material. So I sat down and thought, what do I want? I wanted some intellectual course goals. So I wanted the stuff I could talk to management about, teach them how to write. Teach them who to write for, get them to really think about their audience. And teach them what to write, what words, word choice, sentence structure, all this stuff. But there was actually more I wanted to do than that, because we're talking about emotions as well. So I wanted people to be competent, to know how to do stuff, but I also wanted them to be confident, to feel like, I've got this, I can do this. If I don't know how to write this, I'll try it and it won't kill me. And I also wanted to create a community of people who are interested in writing, so that we could talk to each other afterwards, so that I would be someone they knew, someone they trusted, someone they liked. So basically, I had these sort of 2 goals, the brain goal and the heart goal. To meet that, I created a course outline, and we're going to go through each of the bits of that course, and I'll explain what's in all of them and why I did it the way I did it. But then I also did a bunch of stuff that isn't quite as easily explained, and I'm revealing a lot of secrets here, as it were. Stuff to make people comfortable, stuff to put people in the mindset to be able to learn, stuff to make people happy while they're learning, so they have good associations with what they're learning. And the first thing is, I bring cookies to every course, because feeding people makes them feel safe, confident. That's why all parties end up in the kitchen. Also, it builds community when people eat together, and then they also learn to trust the person who fed them. Hello. So that was nice. I also give long breaks, because people's brains get kind of fried when they go through this much information as I put them through. It's a 3.5-hour course. It takes a whole afternoon. I make sure that there's participation, that they're talking to each other in certain exercises, but also intermittently, I really encourage people to call stuff out. I use geeky examples. We're not documenting some pet store here. All of my examples, as you see from some of my sample slides, are based on science fiction, fantasy, or gaming. And so there's a side game that some people run of trying to identify all my sources, and nobody's managed it yet. One of the things that I do, one of the goals that it took a while to articulate, is that I try to make sure that every single person in the course at least once has been told, that's a really good insight. That's an excellent question. Not everybody gets that one. Something where when they're intelligent, and everybody I've had in my course is super intelligent, I point it out. I make them realize that they are already competent, that they're already good at this, that we're building on things they already have. And this is all about reducing the fear. And of course, I also sometimes have to squash the attention hogs, the teacher's pet types, or the devil's advocate types. But that makes everybody else feel like their contribution is valued. And I mean, I'm never mean about it, much. So let's start. Before I actually start talking, they walk into the room, and this is on the whiteboard, this sentence here. And this sentence here, Chewbacca angrily tore the left arm off of the silver droid, in those colors, followed by the definitions, is a promise to my students that these are the only grammar terms that I'm going to throw around casually. There will be other grammar terms, but they will be on one specific slide and they will be defined on that slide. It's also fair warning, of course, that the whole thing is going to be quite geeky. And then at the end, when we get to glossaries, they realize they've been looking at a glossary all day. So then we start the session. We start with introductions. I introduce myself. I talk about my background in classics, the writing, all these things that come together to who I am and why I'm in the position I'm in. And then I don't introduce them to one another. I go around the table and I say, okay, so tell me your name, what you do, and what's your relationship with writing? What do you feel about writing? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Where are you on that? Because there was one guy, for instance, in Poland, and we did this, and he sat back in his chair, and he folded his arms, and he said, I hate writing. I got into technology so that I could stop studying Polish and stop studying English. I hate it. I mean, what do you say at a moment like that? So I said, you are my target audience. And by the end of the day, he was definitely really confident, wanted to talk more about stuff. It really was a good session for him. And I've seen his writing since then, and it has improved. And then I also talk about the course, about what we're going to be doing, how it's going to work, the fact that there are 96 slides in the slide deck, which is too much for anyone to take notes on. So don't try. Slide deck's available, close your laptop. And that's the important one, of course, because otherwise they're just going to all read their emails throughout the day while they're taking notes. So I'm working on that to create some community and get people to close their laptops. Then we go through the exercise, because I give people homework before we start. I say, spend no more than half an hour writing instructions on putting on a jacket. And that's all I give them. And if they say, but what, and they ask for further details, I say, that's a good question. And then I walk away and make them figure out the answer to the question. So they're basically going through the entire process of asking these questions. And when we get to the jacket exercise, I don't then make them read out their answers. That would be really cruel. And I don't try and put anything on according to the directions. That would be even worse, because I want to talk about the process, about what they learned by actually going through it. And again, what was difficult, what was easy, what did they notice, who picks up that you need to start by thinking about who your user is, why they don't actually know what a jacket is, all of these things. And so you get some great discussions, but it also goes around the table again, gives the group a chance to get to know each other better, and it gives me another chance to say, absolutely correct, that's a really good point. After that, oh yes, and this is one of the slides that I have in my introduction, and I say this is the most important slide in the slide deck. So yeah, this is based on the Pirates of the Caribbean, where they say this about the pirate code. Most writing advice is what you call guidelines rather than actual rules. And I bring it up throughout the course. I'll say, by the way, this is a moment for rule 0, and then they'll know that here's the rule, and here's when you keep it, and here's when you break it. And I'll show you that a little later on. So then we get to the first major meaty stage of the course, and it's the writing process. And I know most of the time people break the writing process into writing and editing, but I add a third stage here, planning. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One reason is writing is hard. It is, and we don't know quite how people go from, I have an idea in my brain, to words on the paper. This is kind of a mysterious process, which is why it falls apart in things like writer's block. So what I try to do is get people to unload a lot of that writing stuff into the planning phase. Figure out who your user is before you start writing. Start figuring out what your controlled vocabulary is before you start writing. So that way, when we get to the writing phase, then there's less to do. And when I talk about the writing phase, the first thing I say is the goal of writing is to produce words. And then I say, you'll notice I didn't say good words. Your first draft can stink. Absolutely. Perfectly okay. If anybody wants it, I do issue certificates of permission to write badly. I sign them. And then I teach 3 different methods of actually writing. So I talk about outlining, and then writing to the outline. I talk about brainstorming, where you assemble all the information and then see what natural structure falls out of that. And then I talk about free writing. And then after that, we do some discussion about editing, the various processes from document level editing through proofreading, all the layers in there. And then we finish with a 5-minute exercise where people try to write instructions for changing a roll of toilet paper using a technique that they don't usually use, just to try stuff out. And every now and then somebody will go, oh, my writing life has changed. And then I'm like, yeah. So here's a slide from that section, for proofreading, and I read it out, and I say, okay, so you're looking for words you've repeated, words that you've missed, sentences you meant to finish but didn't, deviations from the style guide and term list. And about half the class starts laughing when they realize that I have actually made every single mistake that I am reading out right there. And actually, that's a lot of what I do, is make the course funny. So then we take a break, because everybody's tired, and then we get into the meat of the course, which is what I call writing technical prose. It's actually editing technical prose. And for this, we start at word level. We start with word choice, controlled vocabulary, one word, one concept relationships. Do you even want to use technical terms? All that jazz. And then we move up and we talk about sentences. And for each slide, I have a poor choice of sentence, a sentence that runs on too long for one reason or another, and then a better way to do it. And I go through various patterns of the ways that people quite often make their sentences too long. So I'll talk about things like count the number of words between the subject and the verb. See if there's a separate idea in there, because you want to get one idea, one sentence. That way, particularly if you're not a native speaker of English, you're writing short sentences. And short sentences are so much easier to write good short sentences than long sentences. Every slide, like I said, has a specific geeky example. I've got a bunch of commentary around it. At this point, after the number of times I've run this course, I have a stack of 3 or 4 options for jokes and patter, because I've been doing it so often that I have various laugh lines. Then we go to paragraphs, and I try and explain about how to construct a paragraph so it describes one idea so that it's short enough for that. Then we talk about lists and tables and the conventions for those and how you use them and why you use them. And then this last bit that I call writing timelessly. What I'm talking about there is writing the stuff that you're going to be reusing later. So making sure you do things like link to section titles instead of saying see below, so that when you rearrange the document, the links don't immediately break, or the mental model of the user doesn't immediately break. And every time I'm doing it, I'm looking for putting a lot of energy into it. I'm looking for ways to make it funny, make people laugh, make people realize they know something they didn't know, still with comments that people come into saying, again, great observation, that sort of thing. Here, for instance, an example of one of my slides from here, and this is a Rule 0 slide. This is a slide where I explain, you want to write active sentences rather than passive sentences. The top one is a passive sentence because the subject is at the end. And that's more tiring to read because you have to wait for the subject and hold it in your head that there's a subject coming. So the lower sentence is obviously more active and better. But Rule 0, if I am writing the definitive work on planet-destroying engines of the empire, I am much more likely to use the first sentence. Also, if I'm, for instance, a politician, and I want to completely hide who did something, then I will use a passive voice. Mistakes were made. So basically, that's my approach to pretty much all of these slides, is to try and talk about the rule, talk about when you apply the rule, talk about when you don't apply the rule, and say something that makes people laugh. At the end of that, we have a break, and then we come back and we do a group exercise. And the group exercise is where I sit down at the keyboard and people tell me what to type. And what I do is I have written a terrible paragraph. Oh, it is so awful. It is dreadful. It breaks so many of the rules that I have just taught everybody. It verbs proper nouns. It talks in the second person. It uses the word just. I think there might be easy in there too. It's awful, which means that anything that the group does to it is going to be an improvement. And the paragraph itself, and the reason I have that funny picture up, the paragraph is the instruction manual for the Megacorp Sheepinator, which is a device in the Ratchet and Clank games that turns your enemies into sheep. So partway through, they realize that this really is a thing, and then usually there are a few laughs there. Everybody comes up with a different solution. Everybody comes up with a different text. I've saved them all, no two are alike. I'm glad to say that only one group finished the sentence, the list of instructions, with the last step being enjoy your new sheep. One was enough. Okay, so then we move on to writing in English. And this is important because the majority of our developers at TomTom are not native speakers of English. We have very, very few native speakers. So I'm dealing with people with a variety of levels of skill in English and a variety of native languages, which means that there are a variety of different problems. We have an office in Poland, we have an office in Belgrade, we have a bunch of speakers of Russian and Ukrainian and like that in the office, so we have problems with the word the. We've got a bunch of people who have other problems with other things to do, you know, and you can say, I can read at this point. Now I can read text and I can say, that was a native speaker of German wrote that. Okay, that was a native speaker of Spanish, just because of the characteristic errors. And I go through some of those, and sometimes I'll use international rivalries. You know, I'm in Poland and I'll say, and then this is one the Germans do, and it's this one here, and they all laugh. But you have to be careful with that. It's funny, but read the room, because you don't want people to fear that you're going to say something terrible about them behind their backs. So actually, the person I laugh at the most is me, because I'm a native speaker of English. I've learned Dutch. I'm now fluent in Dutch, despite my accent. And so I can quite often say, and here's a mistake I make in Dutch, which is always good because, you know, I'm quite happy to have people laugh at me. I've already proved that in the earlier section of the course. They know that I'm a fair target. So after I talk about common mistakes, then I talk about online tools. And I don't just mean dictionary.com, although I do recommend that and thesaurus.com because they are really good usable dictionaries. But also translation tools. There are things that do contextual translation, where it'll give you not just the translation, but it'll give you the whole sentence that the word's in. Things like Context Reverso, which uses TV and movie subtitle databases for setting them up. And that gives you, for instance, you know then not just give, but give to. You know what the next word is, or the shades of meaning. Verbix, which is a website which conjugates verbs. So you can basically find the past tense of that verb you couldn't remember the past tense of. And then I also talk about why we don't use Google Translate. In other words, that it doesn't work very well. Most people, there's always like one person who's like, oh, but it's good enough. And then I explain why not. I also talk a little bit about InfoSec here, because sometimes there are stories of people translating confidential information on the web and leakage. So something to be careful of. So here, for instance, is an example of that sort of slide. And this one is about a mistake that I make in Dutch the other way around. So in English, only humans and animals and ships, which are always she, have gender. And everything that is not is referred to as it. So if you write, the captain's chair was in the center of the bridge, he was covered in blue plastic, you're in a different genre of literature than I was trying for here. Let's go for it was covered in blue plastic. Then I get into the next section, which is writing technical documents. And what I mean by writing technical documents is, how does all of this stuff that everybody's writing fit into a larger structure? Because they've written these paragraphs, they've written these sentences and all of that, but they don't necessarily know how it all comes together. They don't know how it fits in. So I need to explain to them, even though they very rarely start out, you know, now page 1, I'm going to start writing a new document. I don't even have a template. This is going to be exciting. That's not how it works, obviously. Everybody's updating documentation that they already have instead of originating things. At this point, by the way, everybody's super tired. So this last section of the course, I tend to be very high level. I kind of skip over a bunch of stuff, or I just touch on it lightly and I say, this is stuff you really don't have to remember, but I want you to understand it. So I talk a little bit about appearance. And some of that's the visual guidelines for our company, you know, which fonts you're supposed to use and all of that. But some of it is things like, why do you actually make a list look like a list instead of putting in a paragraph? Is there a reason that we do these things? And I'll show you the slide that I use for part of that in a minute. And then talk a little bit about content, about so what are we putting into the whole document? How can you construct an entire document so that it conveys the information you want, so that your reader goes from a state of ignorance to a state of understanding? And so I talk about things like progressive disclosure. I talk about whether or not you should repeat information, how much should you repeat it, why, and in what contexts. And then I also go through the various elements of a document. So I'll tell them, you know, okay, so here's how you do a code block. Here's something that you're going to want to do for like a glossary. Your headings should all have the same sentence format, all of these things. So we go through a variety of document elements. We covered visual elements a lot, but not as much as we need to. It almost needs its own course. So here, for instance, is the slide that I use, and actually this is going to look a lot like a slide from the last presentation, because I guess great minds move in the same directions here. Why do we have entry points? Why do we have headings? Why do we have subheadings? Why do we have lists? All of these things. And it's because the page then, the reader can go from point to point on the page. This is lorem ipsum. There's no content in here at all. So the reader can just go through this page and find the information that they want. So that's a piece that I explained. Also, by the way, the best part of that is the bullet points. If you, as a reader, see a sentence and a long sentence, your brain gears up to try and parse it. If you, as a reader, see a bullet list, it's like, oh, introduction, parallel items, and you're ready to process it before you even start reading it. So it's this sort of thing that I really emphasize to my students when I'm saying, if it's a list, make it a list. You're not writing a novel here, you're writing an informational document. Over time, the course has evolved, because I started it with a beta group in October of last year, and I had the group, we talked through stuff, and then I bought them coffee. And I said, okay, tear it apart for me, please. Thank you very much. They were friends. And so as time has gone by, I've set up a Microsoft Forms document that basically is a survey for what did you think was good, what did you think was not as good, what worked for you, what didn't work for you, which sections were better than which other sections, rank them in order. And then I read those. They're anonymous, so people can be honest. And that tells me what I need to do. One of the things that it's told me, and I'm actually finding this out with the timings of this talk, is that I should be talking slower and letting people read the slides. Another thing is that my first slide deck had a number of cases where I was violating the rules that I was teaching, not intentionally, as opposed to that thing on proofreading. And so I had to clean up my slide deck. But the biggest thing was, what they told me more than anything else, is don't be afraid to be funny, to be weird, to be undignified. And that is really, if I were going to say that there's one thing that's the trade secret of my course, the reason that people recommend it to their colleagues and everybody's always clamoring for me to set up another course, it's not the cookies. It's the fact that they spend 3.5 hours with me just being goofy and them learning stuff. So there's one slide, which I don't have in here, where I actually imitate the ways that you walk on the planet Dune to avoid a sandworm. I actually go through and do that level of, well, basically being silly. One of the things that I've been doing more and more is running out of time. I'm supposed to be doing a ton of other stuff. I'm supposed to be a content strategist, essentially. But I'm also trying to be doing the Englishing, the final polish of a whole bunch of our documentation. And I can either do that, or I can burn half a day plus extra energy to run a course. And so one of the things that I've been trying to do is figure out how more people can give this. And I have a colleague in Berlin, who's probably watching this, hi David, who has just run his first version of the course. And I learned a lot from the handover, and one of the things I learned is I'm not sure this course can be handed over. Because this course is so idiosyncratic. It's so much me and how I do things and how I approach things that we spent like 3 hours total talking things over about various pieces, and then he'd come to another slide and he'd say, what do you mean by this? And I'm like, we need a video call. You need to switch on your camera because it's hand gestures. And he's like, okay. And I mean, now he understands it. So I think if I were to do this again, and I think what I might have to do in order to open source these slides, which I would like to do, is to make them more generic and rely on my delivery to be eccentric. Because the slides themselves are pretty eccentric, and some of them don't work well without my commentary. So another thing that I would do, teaching, and if you create a slide deck for more than one person to use, or a course for more than one person to use, really good notes. So the presenter's notes in your presentations. Because that was something that was a real weakness for mine. I did some things, links to the Google Developer Documentation Style Guide, which is what we're using as a style guide in TomTom. Well, kind of, there are things I disagree with badly enough to actually change them. But yeah, good notes, not just here's a style guide, but here's what I'm going to talk about. And the other thing is time. It just, it would be really good if I had been in the same city as my colleague David, because he's in Berlin and I'm in Amsterdam, to just talk things over for a whole day. In between, you do a bunch of stuff, and then he says, hey, Abby, that sort of thing would have made things a lot easier. So if you're going to actually try and make this a course that more than one person runs in your organization, if you want to do something like this, make sure that you give enough time for handovers, because then it's going to be the next person who's standing in front of a group of 6 to 8 developers, because that's my class size, and suddenly realizing that they have to figure out how to keep everybody awake for 3.5 hours. And I am so fast, I'm afraid that I'm going to let you go to lunch 5 minutes early, because this is my last slide. This is also the last slide of my other presentation. Like I said, there I am on Twitter as Evil Rooster. I'm Abby on Write the Docs Slack. Feel free to hashtag Write the Docs for these things. I suppose, should I take questions since we've got time, or should we just close it off? Tell me.
Some announcements, actually.
Oh, okay. Well, I planned this very carefully so you would have enough time for your very important announcements. Thank you very much. Thank you.